Thank you for joining today's webinar for an introduction to mutually agreed norms for routing security. Today's webinar is hosted by Internet Society. They are a global cause-driven nonprofit organization that supports and promotes the development of the Internet as a global technical infrastructure, a resource to enrich people's lives and a force for good in society. Last year, the Cybersecurity Tech Board announced a new partnership with Global Forum on Cyber Expertise to strengthen cyber capacity buildings through the exchange of best practices. To further our commitment under that umbrella, we launched a series of webinars to help increase the understanding of key cybersecurity topics, such as the one you're hearing today. Today's webinar is hosted by Andrei Robachevsky, Senior Director of Technology Programs at Internet Society, where his primary area of interest is security and resilience of Internet infrastructure. This work is based on active engagement with operator, research, and policy communities. Prior to joining Internet Society in 2011, Andrei was the Chief Technical Officer of RIPE NCC, leading the development of the company's IT strategy, external and internal IT services, and work of engineering departments. We welcome your questions in the side chat box located on the right-hand side of your screen, as there will be time at the end of the presentation to answer any questions you may have. And now I'd like to welcome Andrei.
Thank you. Thank you, Silas. I hope you hear me well. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining this webinar. In this webinar, we'll be talking about routing security and the way forward that we believe lives through concerted actions of many. I'll begin my webinar with talking about routing security, the problem itself, why it's important, what is the problem, and how it's caused. And then we'll move to MANRS, Mutually Agreed Norms for Routing Security, a global industry initiative that is supported by the Internet Society. And then I'll discuss some of the facets of this initiative as we go along. So let me begin with sort of looking back in the history when the Internet was born and developed about 30 years ago, and to say that the basic building blocks of the Internet that are essential for its operation at that time were designed not with really security in mind. I think the main objective was resilience, simplicity, and ease of deployment. And it shows. I mean, the Internet experienced unprecedented growth and spread, right? It created those building blocks. They created Internet as a best effort, interdependent, global purpose network of networks that support multitude of applications and supports permissionless innovation. So while those qualities were essential for the growth and spread and adoption of the Internet, it was so easy to get connected and participate. They also contributed to many of the security issues that we're dealing today. So I apologize to those who do routing for a living, but just a very basic maybe introduction to routing, how routing, which means sort of building the roadmap of the Internet, understanding for each network where to forward the packets. This is a very simplistic, of course, introduction, but it will help us understand the problem better. So from a routing perspective, inter-domain routing in the Internet, there are about 65,000 networks, independent, what they call autonomous systems. Each of them has a unique number, which is called ASN, to identify itself to other networks. And what happens is that each network knows the networks that are attached to it. Like the customers, the home networks are the things that are directly attached to this network. And it exchanges this information, lets other neighbors know that they can reach those networks through it. Other neighboring networks do the same, exactly the same. They tell other neighbors about what next can be reached through them, also learning this information from other networks. So this information, by exchanging, spread across the whole Internet, and each network builds its own roadmap of the Internet. So ultimately, when this sort of spread of information converges, each network knows where to forward to which network, to which sort of neighbor, forward a packet to a specific destination. All networks in the internet in interdomain routing system are using Border Gateway Protocol, BGP, to exchange reachability information. And unfortunately, this information is mostly based on trust. The BGP, which was developed 30 years ago and literally was done on the back of napkin, but it proved to be extremely scalable and well-performing protocol, but it doesn't have built-in security. So there is no, by using the protocol, there is no way you can validate information you're getting from your neighbor, whether it's correct route or incorrect. So in some of the cases, routing information can be distorted, which can lead to routing incidents. Well, let's talk about those routing incidents in a bit more detail. So there are three types of incidents as it relates to routing or forwarding of packets, and especially when we look at this from a sort of in the context of MANRS. There are routing hijacks, there are routing leaks, and there are spoofing, source IP address spoofing. Let me go each one by one in more detail. So route hijacking, known also as BGP hijacking, is when a network operator impersonates another network. So it accidentally or deliberately announces a prefix that doesn't belong to it, or a prefix that it has really no way to forward traffic to. And what happens is that traffic is routed to the attacker while the victim suffers an outage. So on this particular diagram that you see, the normal flow of traffic is shown with green light. So from a network A to a network 64.501, the traffic flows through network 64.500. Now, an attacker X announces the same prefix that the customer of network IS 64.501 has. And because what I said, the information exchange is based on trust, network B might believe this attacker, especially because one of the major rules is sort of selection of the best route is based on how close the origin of this prefix is located. So obviously, network X is located very close to network B, and therefore they would accept this prefix. And they will propagate this false information down or upstream, and part of the internet will probably believe them. So for part of the internet, they will take wrong route and route traffic instead of IS 64.501 to attacker X. What happens next is anyone's guess. In many cases, this traffic is just dropped on the floor. In some cases, it really impersonates some of the services that belong to this prefix. In some cases, it forwards the traffic further the path. So one of classic examples of this type of attack is what we call YouTube hijack, which happened in 2008 when YouTube was not available for a significant part of the internet for about 2 hours. Let's look at another type of attack. It's more subtle, but probably even more dangerous. That's what is called route leak. In a route leak, it mostly happens when an operator has multiple upstream providers. And a typical mistake, and in many cases that's a mistake, but you see that can be sort of crafted, and that could be a malicious attack, is that a multi-home network, in this case, network 64.501, announces the routes it learns from one transit provider to another transit provider. So in this particular case, let's say Google as example, because they host this public DNS, a very popular service, public DNS resolver. So the prefix is announced by Google and is accepted by the internet. A normal flow of traffic would be just through your upstream 64.500 through the internet to Google. Now, if the multi-home customer IS 64.501 accidentally announces prefix, this Google prefix that learned from transit provider B to IS 64.500, and that IS accepts this route, That creates a route leak. So what makes it? It makes this multi-homed customer 64501 a transit provider for all traffic that goes to public DNS. In many cases, that will cause an outage because this multi-home customer will not be able to cope with this traffic. But in some cases, traffic will pass through and will give this multi-home customer opportunities to mount a man-in-the-middle attacks, do reconnaissance activities, and other malicious things. So it's quite subtle, but very dangerous. Now, of course, sort of publicly known incidents, they caused a lot of outage, and they are well documented. One recent example is what happened in June 2019 when a relatively small network leaked routes from another provider to Verizon, and Verizon accepted them, causing very significant outage. Finally, let me talk about IP address spoofing. So why, this is strictly speaking about forwarding traffic and about denial of service attacks, but it exploits the feature of the routing system that in the internet routing, source IP address is not checked. It's not necessary to check it because only destination matters. And therefore, without special precaution, what happens is that you can impersonate another sender by sort of modifying your source IP address and sending this traffic to a particular destination. When it's used in amplification, reflection, denial of service attacks, it happens the following way. An attack impersonates the IP address of the victim as a source IP address, pretending that traffic comes from the victim. And it sends multiple traffic, usually traffic DNS is used very often, NTP, some other services that allow amplification. And what amplification means is that you send small amount of traffic, but responses to your questions create a much bigger volume. DNS has this property. So it has amplification of maybe up to 80 times. Some other services have even bigger amplification factor. So this open resolver responds with to those questions, but instead of sending traffic to attacker, it sends it to the specified source IP address, which is the address of the victim. And you can see that multiple amplifiers will send traffic to the same victim, overloading infrastructure and creating a denial of service attack. So, well, I mentioned some of those, but yes, those incidents cause real-world problems. This is a summary of what I just discussed. You can see some of the examples of those attacks, but there are many, many more of them that happen in the internet. Just to give you some statistics, only in 2019, there were about more than 10,000 incidents, either outages or attacks, like route leaks and hijacks I described. Now, routing incident, they constitute about 42% of all incidents happening when routing is concerned. 2.5% of all networks were affected by an outage. Almost 4% of all networks were affected by a routing incident. So while outage is more prominent sort of in terms of particular incidents, the effect is much higher by a routing incident, as you can see. And 2% of all networks were responsible for this more than 4,000 routing incidents that happened in 2019. So why is routing security so hard? Also take into account that this problem is known for decades, and the tools and the practices that exist. But at the same time, when we see a routing incident happens and it propagates globally, we see that there are not so many controls that are in place that can stop this routing incident from happening. So if we look at the sort of internet as a network of networks, each network can contribute to routing security. In routing space, everyone is basically equal. Everyone can contribute equally to routing security, but also everyone can wreak havoc, can create these attacks in the routing space. I think it's fair to say that most of network operators would like to have a more secure and resilient routing system because it causes less trouble, it's easy to troubleshoot, and it's stable. Because routing incidents, they are very hard to debug and fix. In many cases, they come as a connectivity problem and need some analysis and debugging. But at the same time, individual networks, while the problem for the global internet is very significant, for an individual network, there is little incentive to take an action. One of the reasons is that even if you put those controls in place, you will contribute to the overall routing security, but there is very little, sort of very small business case to do this for yourself. You will still not be protected because security of your network is in the hands of other operators. So we have a typical collection action problem in this case, when as a group we all strive to, we have sort of all common objective, but because of conflicting interests and lack of incentives, we are not able to move forward. So let me stress one thing about this security that is in the hand of other operators. And let me refer to this incident I mentioned before, the YouTube hijack in 2008. So what happened at that time is that Pakistan Telecom, trying to block YouTube in Pakistan, hijacked this prefix. So Pakistan Telecom, well, supposedly first for just internal market, start announcing prefix that belong to YouTube as if coming from them, as if they were YouTube. But this prefix leaked globally, and their upstream provider propagated this to the rest of the internet. Now, YouTube could have secured their network as much as possible, but still be vulnerable to this attack, because it was up to the PCCW, the upstream provider of Pakistan Telecom, to recognize that this is an incorrect announcement and block it. That's what I say, that security of your own network is in the hands of other operators. How to incentivize, how to motivate others to secure your own network, even if you are competitors? Now, there is this sort of idea, the spirit, that it's a collective responsibility and collective action is required. Now, well, this problem in the past, in some cases, not in all of them, was solved by regulation. But regulation has limits, and especially limits are obvious when it comes to the internet. Even if you can solve or attempt to solve this problem in a particular jurisdiction, problem can happen elsewhere. It can affect anyone happening at another sort of side of the globe. Well, again, back to this example with YouTube. Now, we could have solved this problem in the United States by some heavy regulation, but Pakistan Telecom could still announce this prefix. So there is another avenue, and that's norms that can provide solution in those cases. So there need to be agreement on values and behaviors. And I think every operator agrees, or most of the operators agree on common values: resilient and common and secure global routing system. And behaviors are also known. That's the practices and tools that I mentioned. They are known for decades. You need to clean up your side of the street, right? You need to validate what you accept from your neighbors. And you need to prevent injecting incorrect announcements from your own networks. So behaviors is not enough. To create norms, there are other things that need to happen. Those behaviors should be widely accepted as a good practice. It should not be exactly the least common denominator, but it can be too high, so the majority can more or less easily implement those things and join. And it should be visible and measurable. So here we come to MANRS, mutually agreed norms for routing security. Because MANRS is built on those concepts and tries to build new norms in routing operation. It does it by bringing two things together. One thing is the behaviors that we discussed, and they are documented in MANRS in the form of actions. Actions is something that a network operator that joins this effort has to implement and has to demonstrate that those actions are implemented. We'll talk about the actions a bit later. But behaviors, as we said, not enough. We need to move this into norms. And MANRS builds a visible community of security-minded operators. That's the community that supports social acceptance and peer pressure that moves those behaviors into norms. When not doing something is socially acceptable and might have repercussions. I may have another peering policy with you. I might not peer with you. I might not connect you to the internet exchange, for instance. Now, for MANRS, or for initiative like MANRS to be successful, to really make an impact, scalability is very important. So let me talk a little bit about how we're scaling up. So let's look first at who can actually make an impact. Who are the players in the routing space? And we can sort of, identify 4 categories, or bigger 3 maybe categories of different operators that can positively impact routing security. Well, first of all, enterprise and access networks and transit providers. That's what we call network operators, and that's where MANRS started. Another important player is IXPs. Internet exchange points are hubs of enabling many other networks to interconnect. So that's a good place to sort of impose some routing security, impose some of the controls. And finally, another type of hubs, which are content delivery networks and cloud providers. They are not exchanging traffic between the networks, but they are interconnecting with thousands and thousands of other networks. So their contribution can also be very impactful. And that's where we start. We start with network operators, where MANRS was launched in November 2014. And when MANRS was launched, the baseline, these behaviors that were sort of developed for network operators by network operators themselves. There was a small task force created for this purpose, and Internet Society coordinated this work. We developed 4 basic actions. One action is filtering, which basically says prevent propagation of incorrect routing information. Ensure that what you get from your customers is correct. Validate announcements that you get from your customers. Anti-spoofing, the same thing. Ensure that traffic that goes out from your network doesn't have spoofed IP addresses. And you know what source IP addresses should be coming from your networks and from your customers. So it's relatively easy to implement, especially if you have single-homed stop customers. Coordination, that seems like a very easy action. Publish your contact information and be responsive. And there are known databases where this information is published and used. But this is a very important action, because when incident happens and you need help from a network that is hops and hops away from you, this contact is crucial. And finally, because BGP doesn't have built-in validation mechanism to validate announcements, operators have to rely on out-of-band data, those databases. I mean, in particular, there are 2 types. One is Internet Routing Registries, and another type is RPKI system. So global validation requires publish your information about your announcements so people know what they could expect coming from you and can do this validation if they wish to. So there are 4 actions, and some of operators might say, well, this is motherhood and apple pie. I mean, we've known this for ages, but there are 2 things. First of all, it's supported by the communities I mentioned before. And secondly, it's very tightly scoped. So we are not boiling the ocean here. We're really looking at your side of the street. So when it comes to filtering or anti-spoofing, the scope is your customer base, customer cone. When it comes to global validation, it's not the requirement to validate globally, but to facilitate this global validation by publishing your data. So it's tightly scoped to lower sort of barrier for adoption. So it's relatively easy, especially for small networks, to join MANRS. Sorry. So once we launched the MANRS program, we start using for other partners that can help and promote and scale up this effort further. And IXP's Internet Exchange Points were a very obvious choice. There is a lot of synergy. First of all, IXPs, they form communities with clear operational objective. That's very important. We are looking for communities that can sort of shoulder this effort. And for IXPs, MANRS is a good reference point with global presence, right? It's very useful for building sort of a safe neighborhood, to referring to the same baseline as everyone else. So the question that we asked at the IXP community, how can you contribute? What would be the useful actions that an IXP should implement to improve routing security in this neighborhood, in their community? A task force was formed, and task force went off and created a set of actions. Again, now 5. So we start with 4 now. There were 5 actions. Some of them are similar to actions of the IXPs, but they are tailored specifically for the needs and concerns of Internet Exchange Points. So here are the actions. 2 of them are mandatory. They're marked in blue, and the rest are optional. But many of the IXPs that have joined the effort, they comply with the majority of those actions. So action 1 is extremely important, and that was a very big step forward in enabling routing security in the internet. Action 1 asks ISPs to prevent propagation of incorrect routing information among their peers. And the tool IXPs use for this is so-called route server. You might have heard about this sort of facility, if I may say so. Now, IXP operates that it provides basically a switch, and enables other or members of this IXP to peer and exchange routing information and exchange traffic, of course. Now, in sort of traditional way, it will require that any member sets up peering relationship with all other members of the Internet Exchange individually. Route server simplifies this task. It's a proxy network that allows everyone to peer with this network, and it sort of, translate this routing information, this routing exchange to other networks. So it facilitates multilateral peering. You connect to the route server and you peer with all members, all networks that connect to this route server as well. So this is an excellent point to implement those routing controls. This is an excellent point where you can control whether announcements that come from the peers, they are correct. And that's what action 1 is required. And if this announcement is not validated, it's dropped on the floor. It's not propagated to other peers. That was a very strong action, and we had a very strong discussion about that, but ultimately community agreed that we need to raise this bar that high. Of course, action 2 is very important for the scalability of the MANRS effort, right? While you have those controls, it's also important that your members of the Internet Exchange also work on their side of the street and become part of MANRS and implement their 4 actions that are accessible to network operators. Action 3 is a very common action that's mostly on the level 2, protect the peering platform. It's a public policy of traffic that is not allowed. It's per se not routing, but it's really a very good practice for IXP operation. Action 4, we discussed that. I mean, global operational communication or operational communication is very important globally and also among the members of the Internet Exchange Point. So this action is there. And action 5, it's the tools. It's mostly in the form of Looking Glass. That's the main tool that we're thinking about when we talk about action 5. But that's a great tool that helps members to debug their routing, sort of troubleshoot their routing anomalies. So this program, this facet of MANRS was launched in April 2018, and we are growing since then. So you can see this is sort of an old snapshot of the MANRS website when it looks at some of the IXPs that joined the MANRS in April 2018, and sort of the actions that they are implementing. They are publicly documented on the website. Now, when we come to the third group, the third sort of type of hubs, CDN and cloud providers, this is what we're working now, and it's about to be launched very soon. I don't want to create a spoiler here, but just to explain where we're coming from and what is the incentive. So the idea is that everyone wants to pair with a content delivery network or a cloud provider. The closer you are, your customers, to a CDN, the better performance they get. So peering is very important. So the idea, can we leverage the peering power of CDN and cloud providers to improve routing security? But also, can we also at the same time bring some benefits to CDN and cloud providers, such as create a more stable peering environment, encourage better hygiene from peering partners, also allow yourself to signal better sort of security forward posture and demonstrate responsible behavior? And of course, all of those controls that I mentioned, they ultimately improve operational efficiency for peering interconnections because it minimizes incidents and make troubleshooting more clear. So again, as before, we went off and created a task force. And this task force, that's here, that's quite representative task force with some big names on it. And we went off and we said, okay, maybe existing sets apply to content and CDN providers, maybe not. Let's look, sort of, take a clean slate and create a set of action that would be useful both for CDNs and for the internet. So the result of this work was a draft CDN and cloud provider action set, which was announced for public comment last year, end of last year. We got some public comments, some feedback, and here are the actions. So this is a draft because we haven't launched this yet, but it's pretty stable. And that's the 6th action that CDN and cloud providers are asked to implement if they want to join MANRS. Now, please note 5 of them are mandatory. They are marked in blue, and action 6 is optional. Now, you can see many of those similar actions we looked at when we talked about network operators and when we talked about IXPs. I think 2 of them are very important. It's preventing propagation of incorrect routing information. That works 2-way. That works for inbound traffic, and that works for outbound announcements as well. So the idea here is that action 1 not only sort of creates controls that a CDN or a cloud provider cannot announce incorrect routing information, it also encourages higher routing hygiene from CDN and cloud peering partners. And action 5, it's again encouraging MANRS adoption. That's essential for scalability of this effort. So CDNs and clouds, some of them peer with thousands of networks, and if they actively encourage MANRS adoption, either by creating some peering policies or simply by raising awareness, that could have a great impact and could sort of, create this cascading effect for MANRS. Now, I was talking about scalability and adoption, but of course you have a question, where is MANRS now? Now, right now, as of today, MANRS reached 286 ISPs, network operators, and almost 50 IXPs joined this effort. And you can see this curve, which is only for network operators, this almost 300 network operators that have joined. You can see this line, and it's sort of going pretty steeply up. And hopefully with the next program, it will go even more, even steeper. So that's where we are when it comes to MANRS adoption and scalability. You might say that, hey, you said there's 65 1,000 networks operating in the internet routing system, and you're talking about 300 network operators joining MANRS, isn't it just a drop in the ocean? I would say no, for two reasons. One reason is that in the routing space, there are about 84% that are so-called stub networks. They have no customers, they just have upstream providers. They are not making a lot of routing decisions. They can emit incorrect routing information, but it's mostly the role of this remaining 60% of networks to put controls in place and prevent this from happening. To put other way, so if 16% of networks, those sort of transit networks, create those controls, will have the routing security issue solved. Well, still 16% of 65,000 is a big number, but again, this is just a start. So if we create this cascading effect, then I think we'll reach this number pretty quickly. So this is a demography of the participants, what countries they're coming from. I mean, not surprisingly, we see United States, we see Italy, some European countries. Maybe Brazil is surprising, but this is due to a very good partnership that we struck with NICBR. This is Network Information Coordination Center in Brazil, and they are running the Secure Internet project. Brazil, before, it was quite notorious for routing incidents. There was a lack of routing hygiene, practices were not used. The only goal was just to get connected and start sending traffic. But with this project, with the project of Secure Internet, they raised awareness of routing security issues very significantly, and they promoted MANRS. And look what happens. Brazil is on par with United States, both sort of almost amounting to, well, this is top, I would say, 14 countries. So Brazil and US, they amount to about 1/3 of all participants of MANRS. Now, another question, a good question is, okay, well, does MANRS or efforts like MANRS have any impact? So what I did on this graph, I actually monitored routing incidents using BDP stream data for 3 consecutive years, for 2017, 18, and 19. So I counted those incidents that were reported in these years and also put the graph on number of MANRS members as they grow. Now, correlation is speculative. I mean, we can't say that the number of incidents is decreasing because the membership is increasing, but it's true to say that there was much more awareness, and I think maybe this webinar is also a proof to that, awareness about routing security problem, routing security issues. And there were a lot of efforts, not only MANRS, but in the operators community to fix this problem, to encourage people to implement those controls, if not join MANRS. So this is a good sign. Let's wait to 2020 and see how both curves develop. I hope the blue one goes up and the gray one goes down, of course. Now, let me talk about some other facets of this initiative. And one of them is capacity building, because it's very important to lower, again, the barrier for adoption is not to lower the baseline, but to enable people, enable operators to join this easily. And capacity building was a very important objective for MANRS from the very beginning. And we started this by implementing an implementation guide. So I must say that the actions that I presented to you, they are technology or sort of, practice agnostic. They do not prescribe how those actions should be achieved. What is important in the actions is the outcome, that you prevent propagation of incorrect routing information, that you prevent traffic with spoofed source IP addresses. But of course, for an operator that aspires to join MANRS, that is looking at routing security, the real question, how to implement this. And again, a group of network operators in the frame of best current operational practices task force at RIPE they went off and worked out this implementation guide, collating good practices, implementation practices on how those actions can be implemented. And now this document is also got recognition. RIPE, it's published as RIPE 706 document, but it's still it's a live document, so we are updating this periodically, incorporating new stuff and experience from MANRS members as well. The next thing, based on this implementation guide, we created training tutorials, online training tutorials that are available to anyone. So you may look at this as a sort of easier way to digest implementation thing and sort of create more knowledge and capacity, maybe in some regions of the world that don't have it. So it is actually very well sort of, attended. We don't have online courses yet, but that's in the plans. But people can look at this and self-educate by going through this test modules, training modules. Each of them has a quiz at the end, so you can test your knowledge in MANRS and routing security. The last thing that we developed was is Hands-on Lab, which is also available online, and it's based. It works for 3 platforms: Cisco, Juniper, and MikroTik, and it's really a virtual lab. So a student can log in and create their own environment, and the idea is, hey, this is a network. Could you please make this network MANRS conformant? Could you please implement those controls? And it can be used as a standalone lab, but we also working with some training providers. And if there's some of you here attending the webinar that do training and are interested in this, please contact us. But this lab can be seen maybe used as an end exam. So it's quite often that you attend a training course, a comprehensive training course on BGP, on network security, and then you come back overloaded with this information. You really don't know where to start. So this lab could allow students to sort of, maybe implement something simpler. What I mean, MANRS, making a network MANRS compliant. It doesn't require all knowledge about BGP, traffic engineering, and security. It requires limited knowledge how to implement those actions, but that might empower engineers to go back and implement those simple things. First stepping stone, become MANRS compliant, join MANRS effort, and continue working on securing their networks. So we see potential of this lab as an exam for other training providers. Now, finally, what I would like to talk is what we call MANRS Observatory. When I talked about norms, one of the things that when behaviors become norms is that when you can sort of, leverage peer pressure and social acceptance. And measurements and publicity is very important in this respect. So what we started last year, and we launched this in August 2019, is what we call MANRS Observatory. So MANRS Observatory, it has sort of 2 main goals. One of them is to inform MANRS participants about their degree of commitment. They committed, they joined the MANRS effort, and by the way, when a network joins MANRS, we do the audit. We don't do on-site audit, but we test, we check if there were any incidents associated with this network. Does it have routing information published in the databases? Does it have contact information published? So we do all these checks. We have a quite long checklist. And if network sort of meets all those requirements, they can be accepted. Their application is accepted. And by the way, while evaluating MANRS readiness of the network, we also discuss some of the improvements, and in many cases, people actually joining MANRS, they're also improving the security posture of their network, which is very good. But once they join, we don't do periodic audits. So we were looking at some tool that would allow us to continuously monitor MANRS readiness of MANRS participants. And first, at the first stage, to give this information to themselves. Because I mean, you might be interested, it might be a surprising interest to see how your network looks from the outside, and that's what the observatory does. But because we are basing observatory on passive measurements, and we're not measuring ourselves, we're using data sources that exist, trusted third-party data sources, we actually can measure MANRS readiness not only for the participants, but also for all networks, all 65,000 networks on the internet. And of course, MANRS readiness, those metrics that we develop, it's an indication of routing security, of the state of routing security on the internet. So at the same time, we can also trace and track, we can look at how routing security evolves in the internet, or whether MANRS or other efforts have significant impact, to produce graph like what I showed you before, which I sort of calculated without using observatory because it wasn't in place at that time. So let me show you some of the, maybe talk a little bit just about the measurement framework. So as I said, it's passive. And the advantage is it doesn't require cooperation from the networks. And that means that all 65 networks can be sort of scanned and evaluated on that purpose. There is a caveat, of course, because there is only so much you can measure by passive measurements, right? For instance, what we measure is number of incidents in which a network was involved. But if there are no incidents, it's a good news, but it doesn't mean necessarily that this network has controls. It may be just lucky that incidents haven't emitted from this network. So there's some caveats with data and data quality, but in general, I think it gives a good baseline. So let me quickly go through this. I don't want to stop too much. So a framework was developed for the observatory, a set of metrics for each action that characterize how the readiness of MANRS, how close to the announced commitment the network really achieves. It has two views at the moment. One is public, and public view differs from private, and private is available for MANRS participants only, is that it doesn't allow you to look at network granularity. Because at this point, we don't want to disclose quite sensitive data about individual networks. But for MANRS participants, this data is available, partly also to sort of, facilitate peer pressure. Because if you see on the MANRS list your neighbors or co-participants that are not sort of doing up to their commitments, that's subject for wider discussion in the community. Let me show some of these snapshots. So this is the landing page of the observatory, which provides sort of a factual state of routing security as it relates to MANRS. It talks about incidents, it talks about culprits, it talks about completeness of routing information, and it also talks about averages for MANRS readiness. Those are donut sort of charts that you see at the bottom. And three colors that indicate: blue indicates readiness, yellow indicates aspiration, so you aspire, you're sort of in this transition state, and red indicates lagging. And you can see, for instance, for RPKI, that's early days of its adoption. We're not there yet, but it's pretty nascent right now still. So you see globally it's not very high. You can zoom in, you can look at the country, you can get some basic statistics, and also how a particular country or particular region is performing as MANRS is concerned. And you can also look at some of the historical things. Now, for MANRS participants, there's more information available. So they have access to individual scores for individual networks. I don't know why it's running ahead of me. I apologize for that. So you can see this is a list of networks with their MANRS readiness scores, and you can sort and you can look at them, and you can click on each line, and for the operators of this network, a detailed report is also available. And a detailed report will tell an operator what caused sort of their non-conformance, lower scores, so they can investigate this and fix those problems. So let me stress that MANRS is not the solution. It's really, it's an important step in the right, hopefully, direction, right? It's not a one-stop solution to all of the internet routing problems, right? But it's a way to get communities together, raise awareness, produce some global baseline that you can reference in your work and in the work of some other efforts, and facilitate work aimed at improving routing security. So why join MANRS? Well, there are three main things, and maybe less important, but still very important things. Well, first of all, it's to improve your own security posture and reduce number impact of routing incidents. Remember, I showed you on one of the diagram the route leak when a network, an upstream provider accepted a leak from their customers. In many cases, that causes a lot of problems for this transit provider. So implementing MANRS, putting controls that enable validation of the announcements that you get from your customers can significantly improve routing operations for your own network. Now, as MANRS is developing, awareness is raised as social acceptance or non-acceptance for this type of incidents grows. I think joining MANRS, it means also meeting the expectations of the operators community. And yet, it can be used as a competitive differentiator. One of the things in security in general, and routing security in particular, is there is very difficult to signal your security posture. You can talk a lot about this on your website, but how customers can really sort of differentiate between different operators based on security. So MANRS, I wouldn't call this as a certification program, right? But I think as we beef up the observatory, as we improve our auditing steps, MANRS becomes more and more sort of reputed and more trusted mark. So it can be used as a competitive differentiator. For instance, some of the IXPs on their member list, they're including MANRS as a label to indicate to their members who of them are MANRS participants. I know of one IXP, for instance, that they allow selection of their peering partners based on MANRS. So you may say, I would like to peer only with MANRS, or I would like to peer with this peering policy with MANRS compliant networks. So please, I mean, if you're a network operator or if you're an internet exchange point, please join us. If you're a CDN or cloud provider, just hold on for a second, a couple of days, and you should be able to join us as well. To join us, please go to this URL. There is a form for your category of network. When filling out the form, please provide as much detailed information as possible, because that's very important for the evaluation process. And be aware, it's not yes or no, it's a dialogue. So once you fill out the form, once you join this process, we'll start a dialogue. So even if there's some deficiencies in your network, we'll discuss how to fix them. So it's not like, well, not ready, come when you're ready. And get involved in the community. That's equally important. There's some substantive activities that we are doing and planning to do in the MANRS community, such as updating implementation guide, creating implementation guide for IXPs, well, in future for cloud and CDN providers, and so on and so forth. And I think that concludes my webinar. So please join and protect the core. Thank you very much for your time and attention. I think I can take questions if any.
We have a couple questions here. Just gonna roll through them. Should I ask, how can I secure all activities on accessing the clients using my information spot, which I offer Wi-Fi?
Excuse me, I didn't catch the last bit. So,
how can I secure all activities on accessing to clients who use my information spot, which I offer Wi-Fi?
So when MANRS is concerned, thank you for this question. When MANRS is concerned, we are looking at the borderline of BGP routing. So it's really not any type of connections, interconnections of networks. It's interconnections on interdomain routing. And when we talk about this interface, so one interface is talking BGP to another network, the way to secure, sort of traditional way to secure, is to build access lists. So you know what sort of networks to expect from your customer, from your leaf networks, and you list those networks in the whitelist. There are ways to dynamically generate those lists, and for this, people, for instance, use internet routing registries. There's a more technology sort of advanced approach, which is based on RPKI, which is a cryptography-based way of documenting the announcements. So as I said, RPKI is nascent, but they are sort of counterparts to route objects in the IRR. In RPKI, that's called ROAS, that's route object, route origin attestation. And what it says, it's a cryptographically signed object that says, please expect this prefix to be announced from this autonomous system. And by using this, you can also build filters, but you can also dynamically integrate this in your routing selection process and mark some of the routes you receive from your customers as invalid or as valid. But unfortunately, majority of the routes you receive right now is unknown. So that limits application of this tool right now. But as it gets traction, I think it's a very promising approach.
In terms of implementation and accountability, and in regards to the data that is being collected to show performance and adherence standards, how is performance actually shown? What is done when someone is not meeting the standards? What is the role of all the data beyond the companies want to say?
So right now, we use the observatory as the main tool for that. And right now, we are working on just on peer pressure. So the first step was to launch the observatory and make this data available to MANRS participants. So at least they can see their scores, their own scores, how their network, sort of seen from the outside, related to MANRS. We have discussion in the community on the criteria on long-term conformance. For instance, is it okay if you have once in a while, you can have an incident? Is it okay to have your score lowered for 1 month in 3 months, for instance? So this discussion is being carried out. And the outcome of this discussion is, of course, what to do with members that are sort of continuously not meeting the MANRS standard. They might have joined with good intentions and good security posture, but then maybe some acquisitions happened and some of the networks, they are lowering the overall score. So those discussions are ongoing, but at the moment, we are not exposing this information publicly. It's only available for MANRS participants. It's only discussed internally in the MANRS community. And at the moment, we are just doing the peer pressure and no sort of rules on expelling members from the MANRS community.
How can we implement RPKI authentication? Do we need to have our own server installed?
Well, there are many ways. It also depends. There are two sides. As a client, how to register your RPKI information. So that's the first step. You need to document announcements that are coming from your network, and that can be done in RPKI. Most of the regional internet registries, they offer portals, as far as I know, where you can sort of do this through the web interface. If you want to implement validation of those announcements, that's sort of on the receiving side, then yes, you have to get a validated cache. You have to install some machinery and use some of the protocols. The good thing is that major vendors, equipment vendors, router vendors, they support RPKI. So your router can talk to this validated cache using router validated cache protocol and do on-fly validation of the announcements. But there's some machinery involved. I mean, you can look at the, again, implementation guide for MANRS, because RPKI is mentioned there. So please have a look. There's some information there about this.
More about the MANRS Ambassador Program, if it's related to today's discussion.
So we made several attempts to invest in the program, and this year is really want to formalize this. Unfortunately, the situation with the coronavirus is slowing us a little bit down, because a lot of ambassadorship is based on meeting people face to face. So we are retrenching. We are looking how to do this, how to build this virtual. The main component of the ambassador program is training, because one thing is presentations and slides and raising awareness, but nothing raises awareness better as empowering people to implement those things. So I showed you the lab, and we plan to use this as a core tool for the ambassadorship program. The idea is that we will collect a set of individuals that can go to regional NOCs and regional meetings, and many of those meetings, they have a pre-meeting training sessions. They're really looking forward to this, because capacity building is a big part of their sort of objective. And those ambassadors, they will be trained by us, so it's train the trainer program, and then they can do the training and therefore promote MANRS at the same time. So that's how the ambassadorship program shapes up. But there's also, we have partners. It's organizations that are just interested in promoting routing security, that see MANRS as an important component and as a partner. So here we talk individually. So if you're interested in some collaboration, some collaborative activities, please reach out to us and we can discuss specifics. We can provide you with give you information support. We can provide you with some data. We can even give you, we have a partner account for the observatory on non-disclosure agreement that gives you some more information if you want to talk about routing security, if you want to promote MANRS.
MANRS.
Excuse me, I didn't catch this.
Last question, how do you become a MANRS member?
Right, so, well, what you need to do really is well, first of all, if you're a network operator, let me just maybe give you an example just for this category. For others, it works similar way. If you're a network operator and you talk BGP is really important that you talk BGP, because many of the actions that are based on the assumption that you are BGP speaking network, so you have autonomous system number, you are independent player in the interdomain internet routing, right? That's one of the things. So if you are an autonomous system, right, a network operator, please go to the website and click on join button. You'll be presented with a form that you need to fill out. And when you fill out the forms, it will ask what actions are you implementing. So it's good if you read the document before. There is also a document published on the MANRS website, which is MANRS for Network Operators. It details the requirements for those actions. So as you go through the form, please check the actions that you implement, but also please provide detailed explanation, description of how those actions are implemented. Because if you don't provide this description, we'll have to come back to you with these questions anyway. Now, please don't worry, this description is kept private. It's never published. It's just for the evaluation process. There's also a field comments. So if you want to tell the world publicly about how you implement a particular action, which sometimes is useful, you can use this field. But in the field description, that's only for us, for our evaluation process. Once you complete the form, click send, and we'll come back to you if you have questions. And if sort of we are reassured that you implement those actions, the MANRS actions, you'll become part of this community, which means you will get access to the observatory, you'll be subscribed to the mailing list and participate in discussions. You'll be eligible to be elected into advisory committee, and yeah, you can put MANRS logo on your website. But more importantly, you become more secure.
Well, thank you for answering those questions in this great presentation. That wraps up this webinar. Again, thanks to Internet Society and Andrei for giving this presentation. And if you're looking for more information, please be sure to check out the cybersecurity website. Thank you and have a great day.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for your time. I hope that was useful. Thank you. Bye-bye.